Hi, I'm Alfred Moore and I'm a lecturer in political theory here at the University of York. And I'm going to give you in the next 20 minutes a short introductory lecture, a short mini lecture on political theory, but specifically on the theme of knowledge and politics. Now, this scene will probably be quite familiar to a lot of you. You'll have seen something like this on your TVs if you've been watching the daily press conferences over the last few months. And indeed, the COVID-19 pandemic is the reason that you're all watching this lecture online rather than all crowding into a lecture theatre on York's beautiful campus. So, what I want to talk about in this lecture is the relationship between knowledge and politics. And I think among the many, many things that this experience over the last 4 or 5 months has brought to light, it's just how important and how potentially problematic the relationship between knowledge and politics can be. So I'll start, as we so often do in political theory, with a bit of history. We often want to say that there's nothing new under the sun. So the relationship between knowledge and politics has always been problematic. And if we think back to Plato's Republic, so Plato, nearly 2,500 years ago, living during the Athenian democracy, the democracy that has been taken as the source and in some ways the ideal or the inspiration for our idea of what a democracy could be. So Plato was living under this regime, but he hated it. He hated democracy. And he made a series of profound anti-democratic arguments. And one of the things that he does in Republic is lay out precisely why he thinks democracy is so terrible. What he does in a more positive way is sketch out an ideal of what the perfect state, what the ideal polis would look like, partly by way of setting up a kind of ideal contrast. And Plato is very famously associated with this term philosopher kings. It's variously translated, but his idea was roughly that the best sort of polis would be this kind of harmonious, hierarchical society ruled by philosopher kings, and that these warrior thinkers would have two things: special aptitudes, which they would get from a kind of some innate qualities and some lifelong training. So they would have special knowledge, they would have special virtue. And there would also be, he said, strict limits on their ability to use power for personal gain. Now, when we think about contemporary politics, often the philosopher king is sort of transposed from Plato's language to the modern expert. And it's surprising how often this kind of move takes place. And so I just want to think about that a little more. Can we think of today's experts as being a bit like Plato's philosopher kings? Well, yes and no, of course. That's the sort of answer you'd expect, I'm sure. Plato had his philosopher kings undergoing a kind of weird and specialized training, many, many years in duration, starting with mathematics. They would learn mathematics. They would also learn philosophical argumentation. There would also be a number of years of military service. Okay, that's not generally what people talk about when they think of rule by experts today. Perhaps the key difference is that what Plato thought would be the kind of knowledge that these rulers would have was knowledge of the good, knowledge of what we as a community ought to do, how we ought to live. And in our era, there is a presumption that nobody knows that we all disagree about how we ought to live, that we all disagree about the good. So there's not so much, or at best we might say something like, the people knows best how we ought to live, if you're a certain kind of Democrat. But it's not moral knowledge. Nobody today thinks of experts as having some special access to moral knowledge. But there is clearly a sense in which experts have long training and a refined and focused capacity to reason in ways that might lead to better judgments. And that seems to have an echo of Plato. But again, it's worth noting the difference that for the modern expert, their training and specialism is focused. It's in a particular area. You're an expert in something. Whereas for Plato, again, this was a global kind of knowledge. It was a knowledge of what we ought to do. So if we think then about the idea of limited power of the rule of this kind of philosopher kings, how does that map onto the idea of rule by experts today? Well, Plato had some very weird conditions around how his ruling class ought to live, right? They were to not even have family or property. They would have children in common who they wouldn't know about or raise. It gets a bit weird, right? But what he's trying to do with this is something that we would all recognize. He's trying to limit the corrupting power of dynasty and property. He's trying to disconnect ruling power from familial power. And that's something we can recognize, particularly when we're watching the Trump family in the White House or something, right? Where the blurring of the lines between personal, familial, business, property, and political power, it's all blending into one. So these kind of restrictions don't have a sort of parallel when we talk about experts today, but experts are strongly associated, rightly or wrongly, with something analogous, right? With the value of a kind of independence or impartiality. So there's something about the supposed separateness of experts from politics that grants them the kind of influence, or that grants them the kind of authority that we might want them to exercise. It's precisely because they're not engaged in, for example, financial dealings that have, or that they don't have a direct political interest in their own advice. So much for Plato, right? But this, as I said, this idea of expert power and the idea of rule by experts is something that has lasted right through the history of political thought up to today. And when we think about today's COVID crisis, when we think about expertise in our current political moment, we might think about bodies like SAGE, right, the Special Advisory Group on Emergencies, this UK advisory body that has been much in the news over the last few months. And of course, the UK government line, as Matt Hancock has repeated again and again and again, is that the UK policy is guided by the science. We listen to the advice from SAGE, he said in Parliament, and then take decisions based on it. In many other contexts, he's used slightly more loaded language, saying that we are following the science. And this raises immediately questions like, well, are we following the science? And should we be following the science? In the background of these very contemporary reflections on, say, SAGE and that role of experts, there's this more general question today about, well, should experts have more power? Should we be following the experts more in contemporary politics than we are currently doing? And there's a trend in recent political science and economics, and to some extent political philosophy among a certain sort of group of libertarian political philosophers. There's a sense that experts should have more power. Right? So they draw on a lot of research, public opinion and survey research, showing high levels of public ignorance, as in showing that many members of the public aren't either aware of or are mistakenly fervent in their beliefs in ways that are demonstrably false. Now, this sort of evidence leads some people to suggest that what we need to do in our politics is somehow engineer greater influence, greater reliance on expert bodies, limits on popular influence. How might we insulate expert decisions from popular influence? Think about independent central banks. That's something of the logic. And even in the case of this book that I've just posted up on the picture here, restrictions on voting rights. So, Jason Brennan has argued that there should be limitations on the franchise based on one's knowledge, which is, of course, a profoundly undemocratic argument. And so he is one of these characters who's argued against democracy and for some form of epistocracy, we might say, right? Rule by those who know, rule by experts. Now, those sorts of ideas, as I said, are quite clearly and overtly undemocratic or even anti-democratic. And you can see they have a clear lineage back to someone like Plato. But even if we reject those kinds of ideas, even if we reject the idea that we ought to, say, disempower ordinary voters, or if we ought to insulate, even if we reject those ideas of empowering experts, we're still left with questions about what power they in fact have, or their influence, say, and their proper role in a democratic system. And when we think about that, a standard sort of answer is to say, what's the proper relation between experts and political leaders, or experts and political authority? Well, experts should be on tap, but not on top. It's one of those pithy phrases that has been ascribed to Winston Churchill, but I'm not sure anybody really knows where it comes from, and it doesn't really matter, because what it gets at is a very common intuition about how we can separate expert authority from political authority in a conceptual way and perhaps also in an institutional way. And the separation is this. We say experts can perhaps tell us what we should believe, but they can't tell us what we should do. Your doctor can diagnose you, but he can't tell you whether or not you should go ahead with that operation, right? Whatever it is. Political authorities, on the other hand, can perhaps tell us what to do. That's their business. They are in the business of issuing commands, right? But they can't tell us what to believe. They can make us follow the law, but they can't make us think that they are right. So there's this common sort of separation. And this is a quite widely shared sort of intuition. But here we get back to where I started. I mean, back to the picture of Chris Whitty, the chief medical officer here, and Patrick Vallance, the chief scientific officer, flanking Boris Johnson, the elected political leader. Here it looks like we've got political and expert authority placed on a level, side by side, and in a way that makes it quite hard to tell who's in charge. Now you can see that there might also be some element of interest in this. As in, it may well be that Boris Johnson regards it as being in his interest to make it sound like his decisions are actually being forced on him by these scientists, that they're the ones who are really making the decisions. But whatever's going on there, these lines are blurred. So there's one set of questions about the position of experts in a decision-making process. Are they on tap? Are they on top? How should we relate them? How should we keep them apart? How should we draw on expertise without letting expertise take over? But there's also another way of looking at expert power that says it's not quite so much about who is in formal office telling us what to do, but rather the power of expert discourses. A power exercised through the formation of credible knowledge claims. Now, in this way, this is a line of thought that's represented by someone like Michel Foucault. He said, look, the power of the state extends to our bodies and our conduct, and it does so in a way that he called this biopower, in a way that's distinct from sovereign power. Sovereign power is the sovereign, the government, telling you what you can and can't do. Stand 2 meters away, or whatever it might be. Biopower is rather a kind of knowledge that's geared towards control of bodies and populations. And it's something that doesn't work in quite the same way as sovereign knowledge, with this clear top-down someone commanding you. It's a way in which we police ourselves. We command ourselves, so to speak. We police ourselves and our neighbours. And we do so not in reference to what we think of as formal political commands, but in terms of what we think is good for the community, the health and welfare of the population, and in line with what we take to be expert knowledge. And people who draw on this kind of Foucauldian tradition think that there's something more insidious about this kind of power. Like, this is a kind of power that is related to expertise and it's related to state power, yet it's one that we take up ourselves and that we govern ourselves. We are the ones who police the ways in which we respond to the kind of safety requirements of COVID infectious disease control. Of course, we also question these rules. We also might question and resist. Political contest and disagreement is conducted increasingly on the terrain of claims to expert knowledge. I mean, increasingly, the relationship between those expert advisors and politicians is becoming politicized. But I suppose the question I might leave you with is, among other things, how we should think about that sort of relationship, how we should think of this politics of knowledge. So I'll leave you then with just a few concluding questions. You'll see that particularly among the political theorists, we prefer to multiply the number of questions rather than the number of answers. But to me, what's going on in this politics of knowledge is a fundamental question of political legitimacy. It's a question like, fundamentally, why do we obey? Why do we obey? Is it because we are commanded by the people with the guns? Is it because we are persuaded by the people with the white coats? This is the ambiguity of the expert and political authorities standing side by side. Or is it some strange mixture? And might we think of ourselves more along the lines of something like governing ourselves, like having the state work through us, through our own decisions, through our own practices at the moment? There are also a set of questions about how we should handle expertise. Should we defer more to experts in crises like these? Should we give more power to experts? Why? Why not? What might be the risks? And of course, there was that question that I just touched on a moment ago. Can knowledge really be separated from politics? Should knowledge be separated from politics? And how should the relationship between knowledge and politics, how might we understand that? So on that note, I will leave it for today, and I hope you have a productive discussion following this, and I hope to see at least some of you next year. Thank you very much.